and we will begin. Welcome to everybody. I'm going to turn things over to Conrad, who's going to introduce our first speaker, Ryan.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Ryan Persadie, and I'm really looking forward to what undoubtedly will be a very, very rich presentation. So Ryan Persadie is a writer, artist, educator, and PhD candidate in women and gender studies and sexual diversity studies at the University of Toronto. His aesthetic and scholarly work investigates queer Caribbean diasporas, performance, aesthetics, and Afro-Asian intimacies. His current doctoral work specifically explores how Anglophone Caribbean music, dance, vocality, and embodiment offer salient archives to pursue critical, erotic place and self-making practices within and among queer Indo-Caribbean diasporas. And outside of academia, Ryan is a community organizer with the Caribbean Equality Project and performs as a drag artist where he goes by the stage name of Tifa Wine. And he has, as you will see, really a range of extremely engaging interests, including performance studies, sexuality studies, sound studies, queer studies, drag culture, and so on. So without further ado, let me turn over to Ryan and hear what he has to say to us today.
Thank you so
Conrad. Much. Oh, sorry, Tara. I was just saying thank you as well. Thank you so much to Tara and everyone for making this possible, and thank you for the lovely introduction. It's so great to be here and also be with my good friend and colleague Binta, who we started our PhDs together. So it's so lovely to be in conversation with her as well. So I'm just going to share my screen so I can put up my visuals, and that should be fine. Is everyone able to hear me okay?
We can hear you, and your PowerPoint just came out. Very beautiful.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Excellent. Okay. So I'll begin now. Hodi Lata Mangeshkar Give Me Soca, sings Ricky Jai in his infamous 1988-1989 Soca chutney hit entitled Sumintra. While perched atop what appears to be a rock structure, Indo-Caribbean calypso star Sam Raj Jaimangal, otherwise known as Ricky Jai, sings about an imaginary Indo-Caribbean woman from South Trinidad he meets named Sumintra, who garners his sexual and romantic interest. Characterized through the subjectivity of the Indo-Caribbean cosmopolitan woman, a subject position that Gabrielle Hussein has noted emerges through modernities of the late 20th century Anglophone Eastern Caribbean, Jai's lyrics evidences her prestigious upbringing in Indian gendered customs and socializations. Via the lyric, she parents from Indian walk, attachments to respectability and professionalization echo through the lyric, whole day filling me with she fancy talk, while simultaneously direct in her presentations of erotic autonomy through the lyric, she's a liberated soul. Yet, what is most interesting about this sonic reading into Sumintra is her rejection of overtly coded Indo-Caribbean culture and stereotypes of Indian femininity, such as attachments to passiveness and docilicity, most strikingly sounded through her dismissals of Ricky Jai's romantic advances. Particularly as he notes in the lyrics, he attempts to use elements of a normative Indianness to persuade her in taking interest with him via, and as I'll show you in a second, one of the lyrics where he brings her to an Indian record shop to sort of woo her. And I'm just going to show you sort of a brief clip of this song here with the lyrics.
Bilia chamkegi soca Bilia chamkegi soca Give me soca Boy give me soca Sumintra born in a shocking baby, and she parents from Indian war. This pretty girl have me tracking all day, when she fancy talk. and she blushing back at me. But when I send my letter, she won't send no answer. So I hit the record shops, Indian records are fire. When I read my girl, she said stop, Ricky stop. She said holy lata mangeshkar, give me soca, aha aha. Holy lata mangeshkar, give me soca, aha aha. Tickle me with a la way, soca me till I.
And I'm just going to stop it there. I'll just continue here. Transgressing the notion that an Indo-Caribbean woman's subjectivity can only be produced through engagements with prescriptive markings of normative Indian genderings, or as expressed by interlocutors, what Indian people do Indian things. Sumintra instead opts for a construction of Indianness through a relationality to Afro-Caribbean or Creole signifiers, notably soca, calypso, carnival, and whining. Such a gendered ontology relies on productions of what Gabriel Hussein refers to as gender differential creolization, or the ways in which cosmopolitan ideologies of Indo-Caribbean women's honor, agency, and reputation produce new framings of attachments to Creole subjectivity that existed outside of normative heteromasculinist readings of Creole citizenship, particularly emerging modernities of the 1980s and 90s, became a tool of securing Indo-Caribbean women's agency and social and economic ascension. Disrupting the prelude of Ricky Jai's Carnatic-esque melismas that appropriate Bollywood playback singer Lata Mangeshkar's popular film song Bindiya Chamkegi, which is pictured here in the
Bindiya Chamkegi,
pictured here on the right-hand side from the film. His attempts to sonically seduce Sumintra fails, for it's only through her stark attachments to sonic legacies of Creole femininity and mobilized by soca, a sonic analytic and reading practice I referred to in my dissertation as soca feminism, that her Indianness is able to speak, as she sings, Holdu Lata Mangeshkar, give me soca, aha, aha. Tejaswini Niranjana offers us a brief reading of the song as well in her text Mobilizing India, where she argues that the figure of Sumintra designates a divide between notions of ancestry and culture, the former noting a post-indenture Indianness as a site of cultural memory and lineage, and the latter referring to Indo-Caribbean attachments to Creole identity and Afro-Caribbeanness as characterization of national ethnic markings that become significant to emerging formations of late 20th century Indo-Caribbean womanhood and nationalist citizenships. However, such focused attention to a binary that positions Indo-Caribbeanness and Afro-Caribbeanness as separate and incompatible presents problematic readings of African and Indian racial formations in the Caribbean as always already separate and incompatible. Placing Indianness and Africanness at opposite ends of a polarizing spectrum, which by no means is a new or contemporary formation, largely reverberates a long-standing history and layers of ethnic nationalist imaginaries in the Anglophone Caribbean that take on new life in the queer Caribbean diaspora, an archive and geography I center in this dissertation project. The intimacies and itineraries of labor diasporic histories mobilized by the crossings of the transatlantic slave trade and indentured servitude in the region, in which previously enslaved African and indentured Indian communities were fostered into collective, albeit rapidly evolving plantation geographies, has been reimagined through post-colonial and national narratives of unity, oneness, and togetherness. Slogans such as "Together we aspire, together we achieve" in Trinidad, "Out of one Yemen people" in Jamaica, and "One people, one nation, one destiny" in Guyana reiterate and reorient regional and diasporic intimacies of Africanness and Indianness in the region, as well as other new genealogies of racialized migration subjectivities that follow histories of Middle Passage and Kalapani mobilizations, oftentimes working to romanticize and neutralize histories of interracial, class, and gender tensions, conflict, and violence through contemporary grammars, spaces, and vocalities. We also see this in the context of soca music, where interracial collaborations between Afro and Indo-Caribbean soca artists mobilize the genre via Dogla aesthetics to paint sonic illustrations of an imagined national unity that would quell the fires of racial violence seen over decades of post-colonial struggle. Machel Montano and Drupati Ramganai's Real Unity being one of our most popular and revealing examples. Caribbean historians Bridget Brereton, Audra Dipty, Amar Wahab, David Trotman, and others have all interrogated early relationships between African and Indian communities in the region, evincing how, for the sake of specificity here, British colonial and post-colonial projects of occupation, displacement, and resource extraction relied on identitarian logics of racial classification to reify economic and ecological parameters of emplacement and belonging, for one set of ethnically and racially related communities while erasing and ideologically dislocating its others. Such racial nationalist frameworks became heightened and vexed by emerging nationalist movements in the 1960s, which produced new frictive Indo-Afro intimacies, where we began to see new formations of Indian and African claims to identity, subjectivity, and being in the afterlife of slavery and indenture. While Indians were characterized as foreign, stubborn, mostly for their resistances into emerging new Creole nationalisms, dissident, traditional, miserly, and recalcitrant, as most famously articulated by the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Eric Williams, Africans were positioned as unruly, carnal, aggressive, and lazy, most exacerbated by dominant Indian narratives that indentured labor economically saved Indo-Caribbean countries, saved in quotations, from disaggregation. Bridget Brereton specifically notes that, quote, despite the hardships endured by indentured Indians, the narrative continues that they endured and overcame them. Through their discipline and hard work, they saved the local sugar industry, which might have collapsed if it had continued to depend on scarce and unreliable labor from the Creoles. The genealogy of the hardworking and laborious Qoolie then takes on stark anti-Black meaning as it becomes positioned as a mechanism for manufacturing belonging and social ascension by inheriting and following Euro-American colonial and capitalist logics of social mobility and ascension. I particularly trace this notion of belonging, ascension, and upward mobility in this dissertation within the archive of what becomes Indo-Caribbean subjectivity by developing a concept known as the indentured promise. While the scope of this talk does not provide room to go into detail about the specificities of the indentured promise and how it mobilizes in queer Indo-Caribbean diasporas, I note a brief definition of what I mean by this term to evidence the ways in which a polarizing binary of Indianness and Africanness as separate has always been a fallacy and largely the product of vernacular identitarian projects, oftentimes nationalist. I problematize such a binary by following what trans Black feminist scholar Marquise Bey refers to when he describes identity formations as classificatory violence, or the ways in which normalizing structures such as identity categories in politics are antithetical to liberational and emancipation initiatives, as they follow eugenicist and racial models of entrapment, enclosure, and confinement for the purpose of neocolonial legibility. Marquise Bey argues that if we are to follow the pedagogies of transnational feminist practice, we must abolish the categories we love. In his own words, quote, if we want freedom, we need to free ourselves too of the things which we use to capture ourselves. Or in following transnational feminist M. Jackie Alexander's definitions of the radical, which she recently described in an online seminar entitled Constellations of Relation, are the mobilizations of epistemology that take us towards the edge of thought and outside of ourselves, that which moves beyond the distraction of hegemony and their offspring, such as a turn to sameness, out of which identity is built. Thus, a focus on identity, given that it's a prescriptive classification assigned to us as we emerge in the world, narrows our field of vision and transnational ways of seeing, and that which does not allow us to delve into the interiority of who we are and our formage. Much like Audre Lorde's conception of the erotic, that in the context of queer Black women's struggle lives in a, quote, deeply female and spiritual plane, firmly rooted in the power of unexpressed or unrecognized feeling, end quote, I focus on subjectivity and not identity in this dissertation to explore forms of visceral and embodied knowing, only accessible by turning into knowledge systems that have been rendered inferior by systems of heteropatriarchal domination. And for me, that largely also speaks through the Indo-Afro relationality that I hold as a queer analytic. In order to be able to read into and translate the radical in our everyday practices, I developed the indentured promise to give life to the mundane intimacies of Afro-Asian encounter, pleasure, and harm that are bound up in such legacies of racial enmity and the maintenance of classificatory violence. The indentured promise refers to legacies of entitlement, proprietorship, and deservingness that queer and trans Indo-Caribbean community have to Caribbean cultural resources, Indian-derived and otherwise. I trace the indentured promise to histories of social ascension and upward mobility that were cultivated throughout histories of Indo-Caribbean arrival in the region that position the Indian or Qoolie with the means for growth and development not afforded to those previously enslaved and their descendants. Extensions of such narratives emerge in new ways in queer Toronto and New York City as well, particularly as Indo-Caribbean communities have developed visceral connections to Soca music and Afro-Caribbean cultural archives as sites of self-making, often selectively forgetful of the relationships to Black political struggle these cultural resources were birthed out of. And I now want to briefly play a video that I worked through in my dissertation that sort of echoes this notion of social belonging and ascension that often is produced through reifying anti-Blackness. And this was a video from a press conference held by the UNC, which is one of the sort of main political parties in Trinidad and Tobago that is often grounded as the Indian political party, in contrast to the PNM, which is grounded as the Afro-Caribbean political party. And this is Kamala Persad-Bissessar, who was the previous Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, was also the first Indo-Caribbean woman to become and achieve leadership in this way, producing a very sort of anti-Black narrative around her ascension to belonging that she positions in relationship to slavery. And you'll hear what she has to say, which sort of echoes what I'm describing here. And trigger warning, there is overt displays of anti-Blackness here.
This lady went on a platform last week, and 3 or 4 times, Kamla Sushila Persad-Bissessar. Isn't that a beautiful name? Yeah. What problem you have with my name? What's wrong with my name? Yeah, Camille. At least I have a name for my ancestors. Where you got yours from? Your name is that of a slave master.
And I will stop there. Returning to interventions made by Marquise Bay, M. Jackie Alexander, and Audre Lorde, I too am interested in the life force of feminist knowledge and practice that lives in the bodies of the marginalized, more notably queer and trans Caribbean performance practices within terrains of what I refer to as celebratory geographies. Working through genealogies of Afro-Asia, or perhaps what I refer to as Indo-Afro relationality, I return to Soca music in this presentation to trace the self and placemaking practices of queer Indo-Caribbean communities in Toronto and New York City by specifically turning to party spaces built out of traditions of Afro-Caribbean culture production, which I term in this dissertation as the queer Fête. When I first began thinking about this dissertation, I was largely concerned with the material articulations of race, sexuality, and gender that were being performed through the diasporic itineraries that produced the queer Fête. I was interested in the ways in which the Fête space, which has become part of the social fabric of BIPOC social gathering in urban milieus, such as Toronto and New York City, became inscribed with queer and trans potential. Largely in these early moments, I was thinking about the transformation of the Soca Fête into queer of color diasporic space through disrupting discourses of Caribbeanness that have been largely attached to logics of compulsory heterosexuality, producing new itineraries of queer spatial organizations that simultaneously intervened in how we understand the formation of diaspora. The problem with such conceptualizations, though, is that it does not fulfill the expansive promise of diasporization, instead crafting a definition of diasporic experience based in sameness, ethnic homogeneity, and mutuality, while discounting other identity markers that constitute diaspora, such as gender and sexuality. Furthermore, such discourses also cultivate ontological binaries of legible versus illegible diasporic realities that metaphorize narratives of a dominant community experience to constitute a diasporic space, while simultaneously deploying a politics of otherness and difference to punish those that do not fit in within its epistemological paradigms, outward approach, and linear temporality. For instance, old diaspora studies cannot take into account the ways in which modes of migration are made not only through the homo-way dyad, which I echo one of my supervisors, Dr. Lisa Trotz, and that term I use from her writing, or binaries of originary authentic homeland versus new inauthentic settlement location or homeland displacement models, but how, for instance, the Caribbean is made and can be accessed outside of its geographic borders and from other sites of migration, such as Canada, the US, and the UK. Or put in conversation with scholars of the 1980s and 90s like Avtar Bra, Stuart Hall, and Paul Gilroy, we understand how diasporic experience and placemaking practices can exist outside of fixed origins and desires to return. For instance, Bra's theoretic of diaspora space speaks to desires of making home of the everyday, the right now, and the mundane that help us to conceptualize of diasporic processes through a production of a homing desire, or forms of placemaking that allow marginalized subjects to feel a sense of belonging in community while not necessarily requiring a backwards gaze to a homeland to recuperate one's diasporic condition. Thus, as I continued this work, I came to understand the queer Fête as much more than a physical space. At the current moment, my dissertation project explores the transnational itineraries and spatializations of queer Caribbean diasporas that are made possible through attuning to migratory flows of Anglo-Caribbean popular cultural production, and particularly the ways in which the queer Fête is made across and between the US-Canada border. Centering embodied expressions that are articulated through song, dance, and the voice becomes a central archive and field site to map how racial, sexual, and gender negotiations of self and placemaking practices cultivate new understandings of queer diasporic organization. Inextricably linked to practices of Caribbean carnivalesque and their legacies of nonconformity towards neocolonial powers and Euro-American knowledge production, the Fête is progenitive of distinct sites of diasporic Caribbean cathartic release, or transgressive modalities of free-up, where performances of transgressive embodiments articulated by the body unsettle, loosen, and critique normative ideological regimes of racial, class, sexual, and gendered formations. Rooted in such transgressive genealogies, Soca music, as the central soundscape of the Fête, instructs as well as engages Caribbean diasporic communities in exuberant, albeit lascivious, articulations of bacchanalian looseness and agentive performances of slackness, or what a dancehall scholar Carolyn Cooper refers to as the epitomized antithesis of respectable normativity, temporarily disrupting the hegemonic regulatory and disciplinary ideals of institutional state citizenships rendered compulsory. Practices of unruliness, whatlessness, and no behavior are sounded through the transgressive pedagogies of Soca practice that are often characterized by the presence of ferocious whining, the collective singing of transnational Soca anthems, collective and oftentimes unison productions of popular choreographies, the consumption of alcohol, the undoing of normative formations of ontology through public performances of illicit, perverse, and erotic sexuality, and the waving of national Caribbean flags to the intoxicating rhythms of Soca's sonic force. Due to its disruptive potential towards ideological regimes of normativity, the Soca Fête offers us critical terrain to speak diasporic queer Caribbean subjectivities through sound, voice, and the body within the hegemonic landscape of Canada and the US, where assimilation to whiteness, cis normativity, and compulsory settler heterosexuality continues to legislate one's access to legitimate belonging. Indeed, in the diaspora, the Fête operates as what Camille Hernandez Ramoir refers to as a site of cultural resistance. Here, the Fête becomes a central site of anti-colonial placemaking as the archive of the Caribbean body, sound, voice, and dance cultivates terrains of joy and togetherness, while simultaneously offering critiques against structural hegemonies such as everyday gendered and racial violence, ongoing state surveillance, and anti-Black racism. Following in line with interventions the Fête geography offers, my dissertation then thus accounts for how the Fête has always been a place of queer self and placemaking and pedagogy in two regards. One, as a site in which queer and trans Caribbean community carve out diasporic space as a challenge to nationalist ideologies that always position expressions of sexual difference as always already abject and peripheral to the heterosexual nation state, while simultaneously positioning the Fête as a critical archive of feminist and anti-colonial Caribbean epistemology that is only made possible through listening to the queer politics and pedagogies it engenders. Thus, the Queer Fête is both a place and politic of Caribbean feminist living. Following language offered to us by Rosamund S. King, we can read the Queer Fête and its transgressive pedagogies as a site of Carib global phenomena, or a transnational site of crossing by which the migratory flows of the diaspora and Caribbean region foster a network of connection that evades and refuses regional separations. This is made possible through the migrations of queer Caribbean artists, DJs, organizers, and participants who consistently travel in and out of the diaspora to take part in Queer Fête festivities, oftentimes without having to return to the Caribbean region at all. In other words, the Caribbean lives and is constantly remade outside of its national borders via transnational circuits of cultural production. More specifically, this study investigates how queer diasporic organization is made by attuning to Indo-Caribbean communities and their embodied practices of song, dance, and voice within Queer Fête spaces in Toronto and New York City. I bring these two cities in conversation with one another for two reasons. One, due to their long-standing migratory histories of Indo-Caribbean arrival and legacies of queer Caribbean cultural production, and two, to speak back to the transnational circuits of Queer Fête practice and pedagogy that are produced across the border that in effect challenge our understandings of queer diasporic formation bound by linear trajectories along north-south flows and diaspora homeland dichotomies. And I know I'm running out of time here, so I'm just going to kind of skip ahead to my sort of my case study here. And Atari, if you just remind me, how much time do I have left?
Sorry, I had to unmute. You have up until 2:15. So you want to leave 5 to 10 minutes for questions and discussion?
Perfect. That's great. Thank you so much.
Great.
Okay. So I can go back because I have more time than I thought. Okay. Investigations of sexual and gender diversity and non-Black subjectivities and studies of Caribbean popular culture and Fat cultures more specifically are largely underrepresented. Furthermore, much of the literature surrounding diasporic Fat culture has been produced through three overrepresentations: attachments to compulsory heterosexuality, the elision of non-Black subjectivities, and discussions of queer Caribbean diasporas, and an over-reliance on traditional readings of culture production diaspora that are based upon settler/cartographic paradigms of space. Providing a much-needed corrective in this literature, I bring together notable interventions within the fields of queer Caribbean diaspora studies, transnational feminisms, and sound music and performance studies to investigate how Indo-Caribbean practices of celebratory placemaking have always existed, both through the transitional activations of queer culture production and pedagogy. Following in line with these interventions, I also work to theorize in this dissertation how the logics and practice of Fat making have always been produced through a transnational queer politic, and particularly how the place and politics of the queer Fat have been central to contemporary queer Indo-Caribbean diasporic formations. And again, my reading here of the queer is not just solely attached to the practices of same-sex desire or queer identity, sexual categories, but actually thinking about this sort of Indo-Afro relationality that forces the logic or the characterization of the concept of African and the Indian to sort of rub up and be frictive with one another, which I am holding as sort of an element of queerness too that produces soca music in the queer Fat space, right? While in mainstream imaginings, the Fête is thought often to take place on the Carnival Road or in a nightclub, my informants have showcased how the Fête becomes a mundane archive of queer and trans Indo-Caribbean diasporic political consciousness. In my research, the Fête carries a transnational and mobile quality of spatial and cultural production, carrying potentials to emerge in the space of a basement jam, a parking lot, a heterosexual wedding, a bedroom, or a car, just to name a few. Indeed, my informants have thus demonstrated how the queer Fête operates not only as a material entity in physical space, but also as a transformative and generative archive of queer Caribbean and feminist knowledge production that can only be translated and expressed through embodied acts of knowledge transfer that move through the body. To this end, I have also been thinking about how feminist figures in Caribbean political arena, such as the Jamet, the Soca, Chutney Diva, and the Qoolie woman, to name a few, have been made possible through engagements with the transgressive pedagogies of Fête, although this is not language that would have been used in the colonial archive, that move far beyond the defaulted imaginings of where queer Fête is often thought to exist. My informants have evidence that to engage in Caribbean feminist praxis, Fête making is central to our ongoing learning in political consciousness. So much so that one of my informants, Tina Arnodis, an organizer of the infamous Chutney Pride festivities, which is a longstanding queer Caribbean Fête in New York City, expressed during an interview with me, quote, "It all begins in the Fête," noting the it in this expression, meaning all of our political training starts in the Fête. For following this intervention in the study, I asked what new openings for thinking about queer Caribbean diasporas would be made possible if we were to rethink queer Indo and Afro-Caribbean practices of self and placemaking through the mobilizations of Fête pedagogy. What modes of listening would be required to fully tune to its feminist offerings? This intervention is especially important because of the ways in which Fête space is often overrepresented as exclusively apolitical, fun, neutral, and devoid of political pedagogy. However, alternatively, my informants have revealed the ways in which questions of queer identity, subjectivity, violence, trauma, and memory have often first been understood, negotiated, and resisted within the multiple sites of the Fête, effectively transforming the celebratory geography from its defaulted nature, from a site of neutral joy to a critical terrain of feminist and anti-colonial praxis. At the core of the study is interrogating the relationship between culture production, which I read specifically through song, dance, and vocality, and the formation of queer Indo-Caribbean diaspora. And one of the things I particularly investigate, which speaks largely again to this notion of the indentured promise, is moving through the archive of pain and pleasure, not as relational terms, but terms that are always located in a sort of interstitial relationship with one another. And so while I don't have a lot of time to get through, to talk about all the sort of elements where I'm reading pain and pleasure in this notion, when I began this research, I was starting to think about the ways in which joy and togetherness and collectivity were being produced as sort of a pedagogy of Fête. But as I began the fieldwork, it was actually joy in relationship to violence that people were experiencing. And people also talked about the ways in which they first experienced gendered violence, anti-Black racism, and transphobia in the Fête, even before they had language to talk about these sort of political ways they experienced harm. And so for me, what's very interesting and really critical is to think about the site of the Fête, which becomes a place queer Indo-Caribbean community goes to access and locate freedom, which is sort of how I start my chapter with the indentured promise at the end of my dissertation, is about what does it mean to try and locate freedom via the archives of Afro-Caribbean political and feminist resistance struggle, while at the same time increasingly becoming reliant on adhering to maintenances of anti-Blackness, misogynoir, and settler colonialism in these sorts of spaces. And while I don't, one example I sort of talk about to note this interstices between pain and pleasure is this example of in 2017, during the Canada 150 celebrations, there were a lot of mass bands that came under fire who were part of the Caravana festivities in Toronto for appropriating sacred Indigenous regalia from Indigenous communities on Turtle Island. And a lot of the responses, particularly from the Indo-Caribbean community, were that this culture belonged to them, and sort of the version of the Indian mass. And for anyone who knows a lot about Caribbean Carnival, you know that there's a long-standing tradition of drawing upon what they call the Indian mass or the Indian caricature, which doesn't speak to a sort of South Asian migration history, but a caricature of an Indigenous woman or man on the road, was coming into contact with a lot of First Nations, Indigenous, Métis, Inuit sort of discourses of agency and sovereignty on this land. And sort of that conflation between, well, we exist in this way via these archives and we're not willing to sort of give up this sort of representation because we hold a sense of who we are within this caricature. And so this moment of, you know, this notion of we deserve this caricature, we deserve this archive is one of these questions I'm asking about this, that speaks back to this notion of pain and pleasure, right? So how do Indo-Caribbean queer folks access pleasure through archives that also at the same time simultaneously produce pain, right? And one of the ways I try to trace this is through a formation and a concept known as the Qoolie, but I spell it with a Q, so Qoolie, which I began theorizing in my first year while I took a course with Dr. Elisa Trotz in a transnational Caribbean sexualities course here at WIGSci, where I started to describe this notion of a Qoolie with a Q as distinct Indo-Caribbean embodied languages and pedagogies of self that work through queer Indo-Caribbean embodiments, particularly the remaking of the pejorative term Qoolie with a C from a grammar of harm to one of reclamation. And largely what I was trying to do with this notion of Qoolie with a Q is think about the ways in which queer Indo-Caribbean communities, whether they identify as queer or not, were engaging in these entanglements between Indo-Caribbean cultural expression that is bound up in queerness. Whether they identified again as queer or not. And so I started thinking about, you know, the wedding spaces where you start to see normatively coded masculine, heteromasculine men start to wind up on each other, bend up over each other, engage in sort of expressions that we couldn't call really homosexual or queer, but take on a homoerotic social relational dynamic. And starting to think about how these homoerotic social dynamics are largely not new or contemporary, but speak back to a longstanding history of queer masculinity that emerges through post-indenture feminist practices that begin over the Kalapani, or the Kalapani is used to refer to sort of a counter narrative of you know, a water journey from the subcontinent of South Asia to the Caribbean, very similar to the ways in which the Middle Passage has been described by folks in Black studies, right? And so to think about how these formations of queer post-indentureship masculinities and femininities have always been bound up in queerness. And again, to speak about the ways in which nationalist versions of masculinity have not been able to take up the ways in which the Qoolie with a C has always been in conversation with queerness and queer potential and queer pedagogy.
Anthony?
I think someone's on the mic, sorry. And so
I
just
think we
my
should finish up now, Ryan.
sorry.
I think it's time for you to finish up so we have a little bit of time for questions.
Okay, so well, I'll leave it at that then. And basically my last sort of thing here was just, this was, I was going to talk about sort of the virtual realm that I'm exploring in my first chapter of the dissertation, where during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, because we couldn't sort of mobilizing community in the same way. In physical spaces, we start to see the emergence of Fête spaces that live in the Zoom world. And so you start to see all these organizers and DJs and artists producing these online drag and burlesque performances within these sort of Fête spaces. And one of the folks I talk about in my dissertation is a drag artist named Sundari, the Indian goddess. And you sort of see here the sort of crossings of a normative Indian and a normative Indian sort of representation, and then this sort of Creole aesthetic that she's sort of Doglarizing in this moment. And for anyone who doesn't know, the term Dogla refers to a mixed race Indo-Afro relationality that is happening here. So even though she doesn't have Afro-Caribbean ancestry, the symbolic elements of an Afro-Creole cultural expression is being mobilized here via Carnival to speak back to sort of this Indo-Afro relationality that takes up in queer space. And I, again, love to answer any questions that I couldn't get to at the end of this talk here. But thank you so much to everyone for inviting me here. And I'm so looking forward to being in conversation with Binta afterwards. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ryan. Such interesting work. And welcome to the folks who weren't here before. I see a couple of new people. Aneta is here. Lindsay is here. Premika is here. Dr. Barrett is here. Christina is here. Wonderful to have you all. We have about 5 minutes for questions and comments. Everybody can choose to do that on the chat, or just unmic and say hello to Ryan and tell Ryan what you'd like to know, or give Ryan some feedback on what he's already told us. The floor is open. Ryan, Jackie says she or they particularly like the reclamation of the term Qoolie to Qoolie. Do you want to talk a little bit about that that journey you took to get there?
Yeah, absolutely. When I was thinking about this concept, I was trying to, again, to make sense of these forms of masculinity that I was reading in the chutney music space, the wedding space, where, again, I saw normatively coded heteronormative men sort of occupying these realms of femininity, right? In very sort of embodied ways. And so what was really interesting was queer theory was not able to help me in the same regard, because queer theory is much largely attached, again, to the identity framework of you could not call what these men were doing as gay or bisexual or trans, and that language wasn't working to speak back to what was happening here. But largely, I was thinking with Black feminist scholars like E. Patrick Johnson and Mae Henderson, particularly, E. Patrick Johnson's writing on the queer, which he offers this new version of Black queerness that evades sort of queer theory's framing of identity. Thinking also about the ways in which, people like Audre Lorde has developed a language of Zami, or languages of self, to think about how we can produce new versions of reading and translating these queer embodied practices that are not tied to rigid identity politics. And so, again, for me, the Qoolie is not just about people identify as queer, but again, this pedagogy of queerness that is located in the interiority of our formage, right? Also thinking with people like Hortense Spillers and her formulation of the flesh, right? And not that I'm occupying the flesh in Indo-Caribbean spaces, but thinking of how she argues that, there are hieroglyphics, or there are traces of the traumas of the Middle Passage that are still loaded in the ethnicities of contemporary Afro-diaspora communities, and thinking about how these archives of the post-indentured feminist legacy live in the bodies of these folks, even if they don't read it specifically as that way. And so Qoolie with the Q is helping me, because when you say Qoolie with the Q, nothing changes, right? You say it the same way you would say Qoolie with the C, which is my way of being able to think about how queerness has not ever been peripheral to the site of the Indo-Caribbean subject, but it's always in the interiority, right? And I'm also seeing Dr. Kai Barrett, a colleague of mine from the Caribbean, who also wrote a dissertation on Soca feminisms. And again, really drawing upon also this archive of what does a Soca feminism mean, right? When it is, again, Indo-Caribbean folks are not latching on to things like, traditionally coded Caribbean, Indo-Caribbean elements like chutney music, right? And so what does that mean for someone to build their subjectivity out of an archive which they've inherited via that that crossing of indentureship and the transatlantic slave trade. And so that's sort of why I come to Qoolie with the Q. Hope that answers your question.
Fabulous. You have a couple of comments, Ryan. I'm going to let you take a look at them later. Me, myself, I was putting things into the chat that were really standing out to me so that you would know the things that were resonating with your audience. We have time for one more question. Either put it in the chat or raise your hand or unmute and give Ryan a chance to engage with you. One more, time for one more. Everything's interesting. Ryan, I wanted to know in what way you think your research might engage with your teaching. One of the things that you've had a chance to do here is to engage with some of the courses and students, undergrad students in Caribbean studies. How do you see your research working to enhance the things that we teach in Caribbean studies?
Yeah, that's a great question, because again, for those that don't know, I actually was a high school teacher and I have come from an education background. And so when I was writing this dissertation, I was like, pedagogy is actually central for the ways in which I'm thinking about the Fête, right? And for our students, you know, we often think, you know, I started my dissertation with this joke where when I first told my aunt, who's from Tobago, that I was writing a dissertation on Fête, she was like, you just want to party. That's what she said to me. And I was like, you know, and it's a running joke in my family that I'm just writing about parties because I love to party. But at the same time, party and joy making and these Fête spaces have never been conventionally produced, and it kind of have actually been, as our students are understanding, is where they learn about social dynamics around patriarchy and misogyny and transphobia. It's one of the first places before they have language to understand the party spaces where they understand that visceral knowledge, right? And so I often also, I'm really interested also in transnational feminist scholars who've helped us to think about the body as a site of knowledge and movement as a site of knowledge. So with folks like Indigenous scholar Deanne Millian, Sarah Ahmed, who again talk about sensation as our first source of feminist knowledge making, right? And so I even think about, you know, elders in my community who don't have access to elitist forms of literacy like I'm producing here, but have always moved through the Fête as a form of praxis, right? Even though they don't have the language to do that. And so I think the party space, again, has always been this hyper-political space for people to contend with the ways in which we are inheriting violence and reproducing it, right? And violence just as one capacity, also thinking about identity, subjectivity, memory, trauma. And just to sort of add to that, I didn't spend too much time talking about my method, but my methodology for this dissertation project was largely following a scholar I admire named Crystal Gessioan, who wrote a book called Erotic Cartographies, where she followed a method called emotional mapping, which is basically we create maps with our informants based on their emotion and feeling. And so when I did interviews with my informants, I asked them specifically, I developed a methodology that extends from Crystal called sonic mapping. And the way sonic mapping works is every single person I knew in community has moments in their life that were really compelling for them in understanding race, gender, sexuality, class, etc., that were often tied to songs or dances or movement, right? And so every single informant I interviewed, I started off with, I gave them this handout beforehand that said, I want you to name 6 moments in your life where you remember accessing Fête as a place of joy, as a place of harm, as a place that was contending with your Caribbeanness. And every single one had a memory attached to a song or a sound or a movement, right? They said, I remember when I got hurt that there was Tassa playing in the background, this song was on the radio, and that is what led me to really understand what happened here. And so every interview I did was different, because everyone has different versions of what happens as they happen that were tied to sound. And so I'm largely following sound as a means to trace and map out how people understand queer diaspora, right? Which creates a very sort of multi-layered interstitial map that again defies the settler colonial understanding of space that are bound up in lines, right? And borders and all that sort of stuff. So in terms of a pedagogical set, the archive could never just be built by me. The archive was built through collaboration and through sharing, right? And so this notion of transnational feminists, you know, working through difference was really at the core of how my archive was constantly changing, because of course we always go in and I write in the disc, I've been an artist and in this Fête community for a long time, way before I began grad school. And so I really wanted to build a methodology that would throw my bias out the window a bit and allow my informants to actually build the interview that they wanted to build. So I didn't actually I had sort of moments of questions I wanted to ask, but 90% of the time we ended up somewhere else in the conversation because they had different versions of, the Fête than I did. And that's what was really pushing me in this chapter to think about the car, the basement, the wedding space, all these other places that the virtual, Zoom party, all these places where Fête often doesn't get talked about, but often gets produced every day. And so, pedagogy has been really central, and listening as pedagogy, sound as pedagogy has been really critical to understanding what is this thing called the Queer Fête and how does it play out in Toronto and New York City and beyond as well.
Ryan, fantastic. Fantastic. You have some more folks really commenting and engaging with your work. You have a lot of applause. Let's all take a moment and find the applause clap image and give Ryan a big round of applause. Brilliant work. And now, Agre, can I turn the floor over to you so you can introduce our second speaker from African Studies, Binta.
Thank you, Tara. So Binta, just a quick question. Are you back in Toronto or still in?
So I'm not back in Toronto.
Okay, good. And then the pronouns, she and her, is that okay with you?
Yep.
Okay, great. So good to have you here. So welcome. So I'm gonna introduce you very briefly. So Binta had her early education in Gambia, in West Africa. And then she earned her bachelor's from the University of Western Ontario with a double minor in history and global studies. She obtained her master's in gender development and globalization from the London School of Economics. She has worked with the United Nations World Food Program. She's currently a PhD student, and her research interests include feminist political ecology and political economy, gendered and intersectional vulnerability associated with climate change in the Sahel, climate humanitarianism and climate financing, gender transformative climate responses within the United Nations framework, African feminist, transnational feminism and feminist praxis, environmental politics, governance, regime, and securitization in the Sahel, agri-food regime, livelihood and human security, feminist studies of migration and displacement. And today she's talking to us, and this is the topic of her talk today. Let me just get it. It's, I know you're going to give it to us, but let me just read it. Sahelian realities of climate change, interrogating intersectional vulnerabilities, resilience, and agency in the SeneGambian Anthropocene.
Yeah, the Anthropocene.
Yes, sorry about that. Okay, so welcome. We are excited. I'm looking forward to hearing your talk, and please take over. Go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Let me just try to share my screen.
You should be able to. I made you co-host.
Yes, so I'm just trying to. Okay, I think it has.
Very good.
Everybody seeing?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I'm trying to be on full screen and then okay, I'll start. Hi there, everybody. My name is Binta Bajaha, and as I was kindly introduced, I'll just go straight into it because I don't want to take a lot of time. Give me a moment to time myself. So my topic talks about interrogating intersectional vulnerabilities, resilience, and agency in the SeneGambian Anthropocene. And as I go through the presentation, I'll expand more on the research and how the SeneGambian came about. Climate change will affect all of humanity, but the attritional impact will always be uneven as some bodies have sacrificed over others. There are those bodies that will be really inconvenienced and those who will die, with numerous positions between these two extremes. The Sahel, which is a like special space within the African continent, starting from Senegal all the way to Sudan, perfectly encapsulates this, especially as the concept of the Anthropocene is becoming solidified as a geological truth. The recording of human influence on the Earth's geological makeup generates enough evidence to define climate change as one of its most striking consequences, especially as the emergence of the Anthropocene becomes something visceral for those living in Sahelian spaces. The theorization of the Anthropocene, however, cannot be decoupled from the histories of capitalism and colonialism that is built upon the bedrock of sexism, racism, and classism. The burden that arises from this new geological epoch is placed on the shoulders of those that have contributed the least to the makings of this Anthropocene, shoulders of racialized communities. And within my research, I am focusing solely on Gambian and Senegalese rural, peri-urban, and urban communities. So what do I mean when I talk about SeneGambian viewpoint? So for this study, I reimagined the collapse of two sovereign nations, the Gambia and Senegal. And the Gambia, I'm Gambian, so the Gambia is inside Senegal, right? But this is not the collapse of these two is not a novel idea because the two countries did try to create a confederation between 1981 to 1989, where they tried to unite their militaries, their economies, and their monetary systems. It failed. However, we share, there's a lot of things that we share between these two countries. So in repurposing the spelling of the regular SeneGambia, normally it's spelled with a small g, so S-E-N-E, small g, SeneGambia. In this research, I capitalized G for Gambia to signify the distinctiveness of the country's current realities from that of Senegal's, whilst maintaining the singularity of the name to highlight the two countries' symbiotic cultural, linguistic, and historical relationship. I traced the boundaries of SeneGambia against a couple of kingdoms that existed, Fulani, Soninke, Wolof, and Maninka empires and kingdoms that now bordered temporary sovereign nations of the Gambia and Senegal. So this is just trying to give you guys an idea of where what I'm referring to. So the object of this study, I have 4 research questions, was to use an Afrofeminist and intersectional theoretical framework to ask these pertinent and interrelated research questions. Who are the most vulnerable to climate change and food insecurity? And then the question follows that is, do rural and urban poor women and girls bear the brunt? Second is, does the persistent food insecurity erode the coping strategies in a historically resilient region? What are the sites of vulnerability and sites of agency that exist? And on the micro level, how can we use the frameworks of intersectionality and Afrofeminism in particular to investigate and listen to the real voices of the Sahel within the realms of the Anthropocene? So here I'll give a little overview of how I cultivated what I call the SeneGambian methodologies. So the methodological framework I chose to answer these questions consciously utilized an African-centered feminist approach, which is not solely to boost my credibility of my work as an African scholar, but offers appropriate, exciting, and newer tools to create spaces that could legitimize everyday scale of living in the Gambia and Senegal against the backdrop of the Anthropocene. And specifically, my supervisor and I, Prof. Lowe, we are very, very focused on getting an African-centered feminist approach, because I find that with the way that things expand especially in academia and the way research is, we tend to collapse, and the voices of African voices are still not being used solely to unpack what needs to be unpacked, to be quite fair. So in this spirit, the research conducted had to be useful to the community and reject the habit of collecting stories of pain. The indigenous scholars did talk about that, and I had to really take that up, because she talked about stories of pain and humiliation in the lives of those being researched for commodification purposes. Consequently, the blueprint I used of an African feminist methodology avoided the telling and retelling of a one-dimensional pain and vulnerability narrative. This was done through the multiplicity of qualitative methods that centered indigenous knowledge and local experiences to fill the gaps that exist in the dominant literature. In using feminist pedagogical practice of theorizing from one's position, I use an ethnographic research that uses emotion as an extension of geography. And I also use poetry, oral history, and just day-to-day conversations to fill in the gaps that would otherwise be ignored within the spaces that we currently occupy. The use of personal stories framed and reframed the use of the mundane as archives. And I love how Ryan talked about the archives, so I thought it was a neat, transition. Anchoring local practices and beliefs as an intricate part of ethnographic research methodology that explored everyday actions and stories. Because I felt that's where you could get the stories of the Sahel, the everyday, not from what we already know or what we think we know of the Sahel, especially of SeneGambian spaces. So in my quest to always center those voices, experiences, and emotions of dealing with the fallout from climate change, there was a constant reconceptualization of oneself to understand and appreciate the complexities, the layered multi-dimensionality, and the nuances that exist. So I have to really take a look at myself in the mirror and stop playing these games and try to see myself I am I'm an insider-outsider. I was painfully aware of the exciting yet broad intellectual, political, and ethical questions that come with my own positionality. In this light, I wrote this research from a multitude of positions. I wrote as a Black person, Muslim, African, whose forefathers and mothers navigated the West African Sahel, living in Fulani, Soninke, and Manike enclaves within Mali, Ghana, Songhai empires prior to colonization. And after, during independence, I was somebody that, as a woman who lived an equal number of years within the Gambia, as I had lived outside of it, predominantly in North America and Europe. I also acknowledge that I wrote from a position of privilege, because in my interventions, I have everything that I've come to be here resulted in my formation as an educated upper middle class urbanite in the Gambia. So I always had to remind myself when I was getting into the field, talking to people within the urban centers, within the rural areas, that I might be in that insider outsider position, and I have to be aware and act accordingly if I really wanted to get the real sense of what's happening. So I spoke to quite a number of people. I was counting the numbers today and I realized that there's some that I kind of missed. But overall, I talked to 54 farmers and herders and traders, which I also deemed them experts, because at first I was calling one group the experts and calling the others. And then my professor had to reel me in to remind me if I'm being like looking at it through an Afro-feminist lens, everybody's an expert. These people are probably more expertise in their lives than others. So this is what I call the farming expert, the pastoralist expert, the vegetable trader experts. I spoke to 54 of them, and then 17 food security, economic. Let me just move this panel. Environmentalists and economic experts. In the Gambia, I know it all starts with a B. It's not a conspiracy. My name and my last name starts with a B as well, but these are all the cities, the villages and towns that I went to. Bakau, Baja, Kunda, Banjul, and Basse in the Gambia. And in Senegal, Dakar, which is the capital, Podor, and Tambacounda. So the northern tip of Senegal and the very eastern one, Tambacounda, almost borders Mali. So there's a bunch of traveling in places that was my first time sometimes getting there. And I divided these two into two groups. Group one, which were the farmer herder experts, and group two. Okay. So I used three conceptual frameworks to anchor my research: necropolitics, Afrofeminist intersectionality, and Black feminist political ecology. Repositioning the discourse on human insecurities in the Sahel needs a form of intellectual negotiation amongst existing mainstream and more neurotic epistemes. I thus situated my research within 3 bodies of work that I strongly believe should frame my understanding of the Sahelian Anthropocene. And in this way, using these 3 frameworks, I was able to directly place climate change in conversation with food insecurity to understand the consequence of the Anthropocene on SeneGambian communities, right? So for necropolitics, for example, the convergence of historical, socioeconomic, and political processes that exacerbates compounding risk of climate change across the region exposes a population through what Achilles Membe calls the act of letting die. So uses Membe's treatise on necropolitics, I applied it to climate change and food insecurity because I felt it went beyond the Foucauldian right to kill discourse. And it explores the right to expose certain bodies to possibility of death, right? So this exposure to death can be placed in another direct conversation with Rob Nixon's concept of slow violence in his 2011 book, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor. And as he introduced the term slow violence, it really just meant watching unfolding environmental catastrophe of violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, and attritional violence that is not typically viewed as violence at all. And I felt this really could see because sometimes when we take a look at climate change, impacts of climate change, because I work for the World Food Program, and it has to be so catastrophic for us to talk about it. But the slow unfolding of crisis, it's as if we tend to just ignore it. So I felt the necropolitics framework really captured that and remind us how it's slow and some bodies are left to die. Second, the Afrofeminist intersectionality is something that I felt like I needed to anchor it really on the mainstream feminist frameworks, heteronormative, because on the mainstream feminist framework, heteronormative racist and neocolonial thoughts abound. So I needed to link Afrofeminism to intersectionality. As stated in previously in the beginning of this talk, impacts of climate change cannot simply be reduced to narrow binaries of gender, race, or locality, because other categorizations exist. And within what I call SeneGambia, ethnicity, literacy, livelihoods. If in the rural areas of some compounds, how many people are you living with? Are you a co-wife if you're a woman? Are you a migrant? Are are people transversing the two countries? So these are things that cannot be ignored, and we can't just keep going by narrow binaries of gender, race every single time. I therefore lean on the intellectual and political labor of African and Black feminists in the theorization of intersectionality. From using Patricia Hill Collins' view of the existence of the no existence of pure victims nor pure oppressors, I also use Professor Mariam Lowe's lens with Sylvia Tamale and Oyewome Orenke and other African feminist theorization of differences that are not captured outside of these intellectual pools of knowledge that we could grasp. So I felt it was my responsibility to center the knowledge shared by these African feminist scholars and use that in my work. So in the Sahel, we ought to highlight the vulnerabilities and privilege that stick to different and intersecting social markers. I focused on gender, seniority, age, because that's a very important aspect of difference, financial and social capital, and livelihood resources. Ethnicity plays a role a little bit, but then I just, I didn't really focus on that as much because I felt I had other things to focus on. Lastly, I used Black feminist political ecology to disrupt the binaries present in climate change discourses. So to conceptualize positioning of these two troubles the geographic imaginaries of the Sahel, because it helps me question space, place, and power. As a majority of Black geographers that use feminist political ecology focus on race, I've decided to take it and pivot it to use it with the other differences that I spoke about, but most importantly, to shed everyday strategies of survival, resistance, and agency, and the everyday negotiations between the three. So this is how I anchored my research. So, summary of contribution. I will just focus more on my vulnerability chapter and just give you like a summary of the resilience bit, because I wanted to have a conversation more than just going, spending most of the time presenting. So these are, so the question came when, you know, you get overwhelmed when you go in and get all the data, and you keep asking yourself, who's like, from what I've got, who's the most vulnerable, and what can I compare my data to what you know, like what people have been saying. So these are things that I just pulled together, like farmers or herders. So pastoralists or farmers, rural or urban dwellers. Badwalayi or bottom halisi is wolof, that means the poor or the rich. And if we're talking about women, are we talking about the widow, the girl child, the one with co-wife, the single woman, the married woman? And what basically the summary is, it's never simple, it's never a binary. It's never rural or farmers. So we've seen instances where rural folks within where I went to do my research felt better off than those in the urban areas, right? Due to population concentration in forever expanding urban and peri-urban spaces. Whilst also the most expected was you felt rural communities feeling as if they don't have as much support and as much space to jump into other forms of livelihoods as compared to the urbanites. When we went to, because if you take a look at the Sahel, some of the narratives in the Sahel always seems to have this, climate change is going to create more violence in the Sahel because the Fulani pastoralists are just wading through the city. Tambacounda, which is in Senegal, and Podor, northern part of Senegal, border Mauritania, both of these sites, and they're all Fulani villages, a majority of them, they are as baffled as I was as to the narrative that's dominated the media and dominated academia as to the difference between farmers and herders, because for them, they are farmers and herders. So in that way, when you are unpacking who climate change affects, you have to be able to see that I find that you have to be able to see it as they present their lives. It's complicated. It makes for complicated writing, but that's our responsibility if we say that we're scholars. And that's what I'll get into. So over here, I provide a snippet from key informants, some of the key informants that I were able to, I thought it was interesting to show, because it showed a convergence in the analysis and interpretation of climatic realities and how people respond to anthropogenic climate change in the region. The first one is the scarcity of water is a problem. The abundance of water is also a problem. It's a World Food Program meteorologist and a climate change expert within the United Nations. Because on one hand, when we talk about climate change, you assume it's, especially in the Sahel, it's the expansion of the Sahara, how dry it is, the lack of rain, which is true. The same thing's true as if the rainy season is just pushed much later and it comes in much intense erratic rainfalls. Like when I had my first, my second field visit to the Gambia in July, it was all about the rainy season is super. All the farmers I spoke to freaked out because they already planted some of their seeds and there was no rain. Normally rain starts in May all the way till September. I left, went to Senegal, and in August, Gambia had floods. Massive. So the farmers still lost out because most of the things that they planted flooded. So you see, it's like a very dynamic situation. So in this research, a lot of writing, but it was able to talk about the dryness and like the heat and the lack of rain, but also at the same time talk about the flooding and the extreme. So I'll just read this in Wolof and then translate it. A market vendor told me, which means the sky opens up very strongly and closes up very strongly as well, which actually just reflects how they see when you do the rainy season to start, which has been the same for centuries. So people have gathered and they have created cultures and stories and who they are based on these seasons. And if it changes drastically, one doesn't know what to really do. And in one of the village chiefs in Jinkore, Fulbe, Tambacounda, Senegal said, Janta Merna, tàngoor bi mu ngi feeku, suuf si dee na. The sun is angry, the heat is settling, is dead with us, and the soil is dead. So these are constant themes that I was able to pick up on: the death of the soil, the death of what we think we're gonna, how we will face it. So hence I felt necropolitics was extremely important in just capturing it. And I organized some of my chapters to just say necropolitics and how basically I was able to bring a convergence of thoughts from different people, from UN experts who have never been to Senegal and Gambia, to Senegalese village chiefs, to a market vendor in Bakau, for example. So this is one of a code that this beginning of this year, that when I went to Podor, which is northern part of Senegal, I felt basically encapsulated what how the research was playing out. Because for Membe, when I take a look at the necropolitics of climate change, he says for a large share of humanity, the end of the world has already occurred. And this gentleman, Suleiman Jallo from Podor, he's a farmer and a herder. I mean, he was a herder until he lost his cattle. He said, and I'll just translate it directly to say, we aren't living, we're basically the living dead. Those that are suffering are the ones today that have the courage to speak up. The person who isn't hungry won't be bothered to speak up. A hungry person, on the other hand, will speak up. I am hungry and desperate, so today I'll offer my peace of mind. The climate has brought difficulties that are making us question our existence on this earth. So this was something to me that really, the postulation that those over the edge cannot be considered human due to the economic frustration as traditional stable livelihoods disappear is a chilling reminder of the impacts of climate change on the psyche, on the body, on the land, and overall being of those at the forefront of crisis. So we see from these short snippets of conversations how farmers, vegetable and fruit sellers, and herders all have similar and converging views on the burdens of climate change they face. For the SeneGambian region, the manifestation of climate change sees a decreased water availability due to sporadic and shorter rainy seasons, which is Nawetbi, the rainy season, increase in heat waves, Tangorbi, due to the prolonged dry season, and the overdependence on monoculture farming due to the failure of traditional crops, leading to soil degradation and soil erosion. Hence, Sufi Mode, like the soil is dead. All in all, however, as these things are happening, I knew at the back of my mind, speaking out of all these languages, I only speak Wolof. So I had to get translators from Mandinka and Fulani. And my mother is Fulani. So sometimes when I forget, when I can't hear, transcribe it, I'll call her. She might call me back in 5 minutes. She might call me back in 3 hours. So I had to find someone who will be able to help me translate the Fulani aspect. But the singular narrative of vulnerability and victimhood highlighted should be as acknowledged and as real as the accumulated experience of population SeneGambia that use traditional principles of self-reliance to organize the community. So at first, when I started the research, I wanted to create a balance, but I never knew this is how it'll be formed because you just don't know. You have an idea. Yeah, I'm pretty sure people are resilient somehow because that's what is flooding vulnerability versus resiliency. But as soon as I stepped back home and I went to Senegal and within Senegal and Gambia, these traditional concepts of resilience kept coming up over and over and over again. So the Wolof concept of Gorgorlu, which is, I worked on that. I worked on an aspect of it when I was doing my master's at the London School of Economics. And then when I was applying for University of Toronto, Prof. Mariam Lowe also talked about that issue. So I felt, oh my God, she took it and turned into a whole feminist probe as to Gor means a man. Gorgorlu means basically the virtue of hard work, but it links it directly to, it's very gendered. So Prof. Lowe had her research which talked about people talking about Jigin Lo, because Jigin means woman. So being a woman and working hard through a woman's virtue. All in all, despite its very gendered nature, it applies it applies throughout gender. It doesn't really stop at, if they say Gorgo doesn't mean only a man is applicable to a man. And within the Gambia and Senegal, most of the, let me start with Gambia. Within the Gambia, most of the rice farmers and most of the vegetable farmers are women. So when I was speaking to them, most of them will say things like, you know, things are very, very hard. Why things are very, very hard, but I have to basically man up. I have to man up and I have to work extremely hard. And they're not saying that as if to diminish themselves as women. In fact, they're saying that because they are women, they could occupy the space that no man could occupy, where they could work from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. in the farms, come feed their families, give money to their husbands, and repeat it like the next day. That's one of the concepts. And then the other concept, the Mandinka concept, which is the largest tribe in the Gambia, is Tesito. Tesito is similar to Gurgulu, but it came out of, it's the Mandinka with it. If I translate it to English, it will mean to actually tie your back. In most African cultures, when you're working hard, you have a wrapper and you have to tie the wrapper really tight around your waist. So basically, Tesito means you're tying this wrapper around your waist to face any sort of hardship. And in the 70s, after independence, the government tried to tap into the Tesito part of national consciousness to talk about self-reliance and communal efforts. I spoke to an old guy, he's probably in his 90s, 98, 99 years old, who remembers a time when if someone's having difficulty with their farming, the entire community will come and help that person with farm and then move on to their farms. But he was talking about in a way as if these type of communal social safety nets still exist, but not in those ways, because of course things have changed a little bit. But it still reminded me, and I was able to link this concept of Tesito, how people are still surviving, how women farmers that were normally farming rice had to stop because of, had to pivot actually, and actually start growing incense and make incense and sell. So people, yes, the desperation impacts of climate change is affecting them, but they're always finding ways of tying their waist, waking up in the morning and figuring out what to do the next day. So the Fulani concept of Ternande is also a concept of working so hard because you're proud to be Fulani. It's part of the Fulani pathways. So when I was speaking to people in Podor and Tambakuna, they kept focusing on, if one of them, Suleiman Jallo, talked about how he's the living dead, that is, the reality of that is there, but also the reality of the concept, the indigenous African concepts of working hard in multiple different ethnicities was also there. So I'll just give you the quotations to close it up so we could have a conversation. Done. This was by Aissatou Ba, a lady who moved from the urban areas of the Gambia to the rural areas because she got married and she moved, which is very rare because normally people who move from rural, you assume rural to urban. She moved from urban to rural. And for her, this was her reality. The rural areas fare better in my view as I can support myself through the vegetables I sell and even support my parents back in Serekunda. Serekunda's the biggest town in the biggest city in Gambia in the urban space. I'm the firstborn child, and especially since I do not have brothers, I have to step in to not only ensure as the eldest, I made a typo, but also as a daughter. I send charcoal, peanut butter, and vegetables as it is cheaper here. This is how sutura is achieved. Sutura is also one in which one has to shield themselves from exposure to how difficult or how much you're struggling. Once you struggle, you're supposed to own that struggle and not share it out with the world. And I brought up this quote because she says that she's the eldest. And back home, it's not, if gender plays a role, but if you are the eldest, that plays much more of a role. And then she said, "Borom jabot danga gorgo." Meaning someone with a family, you have to step up and work really, really hard. Binta Bajaha from Bajakunda, a rural area, says, "I work from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. every day. As a woman, it is in our being to work just as hard because the world will not take care of us. Ever since my husband died, my co-wives and I lean on each other in ways that I cannot imagine doing what we call life without them." Her husband had 3 wives. I think she was the second wife. So it shows a different reality, as in, I could come in there and be like, oh, you have a co-wife. I don't know how you could do that. But for her, it was a source of sisterhood that protected her. When that husband died, she was able to still continue with their farm. They didn't lose their farm, and they were able to help one another out. However, in the research, I'll also show how widows, because of some traditional cultures, and because of some misinterpretation of Islamic traditions, some widows are really, really the most vulnerable. But I'm able to bring this up as well to see how a widow who has co-wives feels as if she's the sisterhood she's created has helped her a lot. Oops. And Ternande, as part of Lawal Fulbe, the Fulani Parkway, so despite a tough situation we find ourselves, then Gum Futa, we believe in Futa, because Futa is the region, the traditional region of the Tukulors that are from Senegal, the Fulani. So he's saying that they believe in the region, the land, is because they want to stay. Like they believe that the land is blessed, and all that's missing, all that is missing is for them to get access to help. You know, so if there's things that are beyond them, so if they just access from governments to get better resistant seeds, to get animals that are drought resistant, they feel they'll be able to continue their livelihoods. And my last slide, this is still a chapter that I'm working on, is I present to you the vulnerability aspect, the resilience aspect, but where am I at right now trying to analyze all this data that I got? One of the environmental experts told me, I'm not solo, why mun fog mujie. So mun is also this concept of endurance. So he was trying to explain to me how people have endured and endured and endured, and now they're asked to endure even more with this Anthropocene, where the people that burn the least fossil fuel, the people that are least responsible for it have to shoulder the burden, and they can't do it anymore. So there's also a side of like resistance where, you know, if Western powers are not trying to work on climate change, yes, it falls back on the poorest, it falls back on those that are forgotten, but there's a point where they can't take it anymore. And then Mamadou Khan in Senegal says, "Gorgolu chipo mo tinande, wanted di wax ni mu gorgolu, danga fekk nga jokkalu mo gorgolu." Meaning it's good to talk about virtue of hard work, but to ask someone to keep working hard, you have to give them the tools that they need to continue working hard. So I'll end my talk here because I feel like we could have a conversation, and I hope I was able to present, to give a broad view of what I've been working on.
Excellent work, Binta. It's so wonderful to hear you talk about your work in progress. Agri, do you want to lead the conversation?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we can. So we have how many more minutes do we have?
Why don't you say another 8 or 9?
Minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, so any questions from the audience? Any questions for Binta?
Perfect, guys. Don't ask any questions.
I actually have one, but I know you can answer, Binta. How did you choose your 3 anchors? Your 3 anchors each give you something very specific to analyze the experience of your experts with. And they also seem to speak to each other in some really interesting ways. You know, how did you come up with those 3 anchors?
So the 3, I knew that, well, one is very obvious. If I'm in the WGSI, Women Gender Studies, I have to have a feminist framework. And that has been something that I've been working on from my master's, I would say, more so. But the other 2, necropolitics and necropolitics and feminist political ecology, but adding the Black feminist political ecology, I had to really ensure that this is something that I have to, it's okay. And I love how in feminist methodology, it tells you to break things up and add things back So in doing the work that needed to be done, and if I was serious in focusing on a new line of sight, new area of information sharing that I want to share with the academe, I have to be able to use the tools that are already available, but mix it up in a way that works for me, that could tell the stories that I think needs to be told. So necropolitics, climate change, the first thing you think about is doomsday, right? So necropolitics really does encapsulate that, because people are super vulnerable, and the most vulnerable are located in the global south. And within the global south, on the African continent, it would be the Sahel. And within the Sahel, we hear stories about the Malis and the Burkina and the Nigers, but you don't really hear about Senegal and Gambia, especially not Gambia. It's the smallest country in the African continent. So I found that if I was to take necropolitics and talk about slow violence, how violence is not seen as violence at all, in that way, I'll be able to write convincingly and present stories in a convincing way that says some people are being left to die, which is the truth. Now, the Afro-feminist intersectionality, as I said before, was to center African voices. And even in centering African voices, if the feminist turn that has occurred in African academia in the 80s, African women voices were still missing. But to use the Afro-feminist intersectional lens was super intentional, because I needed to hear from not only the Black and Caribbean angle, which is where, but the African intersectional perspective, very different. It wouldn't talk about race, for example, except here in South Africa or other countries that have racial differences. But for us, it will talk about age, it will talk about your location, it will talk about your socioeconomic background. So that's why I felt that was important. And the Black feminist political ecology will then help me to present the resilience stories that needs to be told in a particular manner. Because then I'll be able to talk about power place and other things that I felt feminist political ecology will give me that soft landing. And it worked together. It worked. I think it works pretty well together so far. Let's see.
That was such a great answer, and I took notes because it was so great, because I know a lot of grad students I work with struggle to figure out which academic conversations are best, placed together. I loved your metaphor of anchor as well, to explain what it is that I've had. Folks sometimes start reading in several areas, and once they do their field work the way both you and Ryan have done, they realize they need to go to different academic conversations. And I always find when scholars talk about how they came to their academic conversations to explain their findings, it's a great conversation and a great learning tool. So thanks for that. That was great.
Okay, any other question? Just one little one. This is a very small one. The experts you talked about, were they all aware that the challenges, the problems they are facing are because of climate change, or some are they aware, or is some of it was your interpretation?
So when I spoke to, let's say, first, I was kind of nervous as to, if I say climate change, what will that even mean in these different languages, right? So then you start talking about, in the Gambia, there's no need for me to talk about snow. So I'll be like, okay, the rain, right? So the rain and the heat and what's happened. So sometimes you say climate, even though Gambians don't speak French, but they speak Wolof, which is the same as Senegal, and they will say, oh yeah, climat. So climat is French, no? But climat, and they will immediately start talking about, oh yeah, the rain doesn't show up the same way it used to, or there was a specific type of cloud that would tell people eons ago the rainy season will start in a week or two, and these clouds come and go and nothing starts. So I find that first I was pretty rigid, right? Yeah, so climate change, and then eventually I'm like, you have to get it together, because then you have to ask them about if you say climate change, even I couldn't interpret that in Wolof. So then I had great interpreters that were able to just talk about the rain, the dryness, and then eventually the conversations will. But people were pretty quick to talk about the climate, because the climate really affects their everyday lives, right? And it got to a point where I had to really thank God for Prof. Lo, because like, oh, I talk to the fisher people and the water and the river and the ocean, and she's like, focus. So then it had to be like, oh, else you just keep going on and on, right? So then farmers, pastoralists, but then it does affect way more people, like Gambians and Senegal fish a lot, especially in Gambia. And the fishing is no longer a very sustainable form of livelihood. But it wasn't too hard. But what there's a chapter that at the beginning of the chapter, I have the different terms that people use in their language, which is much richer than English and French, way richer. Like rain has there's 5 different types of rain, 4 different types of clouds that they could explain to you exactly what this cloud does. So I use that in the beginning of one of my chapters, because I don't speak the other languages, but it was super interesting to know how they are way more in tune and way more attuned to the differences of the climate, because this is close to their livelihood.
I really like that referring to them as experts, and you just proved they're real experts. Just one more thing about polygamy. We always think about polygamy as something that is so bad for women, but you gave this example of this woman who's a widow, who thought it's like the co-wives were very, very helpful in her life, providing support and all that. Is that the same for other women you found, other women in polygamous marriages, or that was an exception?
So it wasn't as much as an exception as I thought. Because when I first spoke to her, I was like, girl, you must be very lucky. Wow, you love your co-wives? Because I'm still thinking. And this is when I remind myself of my position as an urbanite or someone who believes in certain things, you know? And then, but you go on and you find in the rural, even in the urban centers, but I didn't speak to a lot of, I didn't really go to like urban centers, like their homes, but in the rural areas, I went to their homes. But they were just able to explain to me, hey, yes, it might be a form of disadvantage because they got married younger, or maybe, you know, resources were not there, but when tragedy struck, I had my co-wives in order to do, because the first wife will be the ones that would then create order. Goes back to the thing of age, because in the African culture, age actually begets gender, right? So in my own family, I'm the eldest child. Not my brother, I get to determine some things rather than gender. So I wanted to show, and that I actually forgot about that. Right? This is when you're in these Western spaces, when you go home and you get shocked, like, oh yeah, it is about age, right? So I felt that it was my responsibility to present that in a way. And I found other women too that had their co-wives. There was one that got married when she was 13, 14. Her husband died by the time she was 24. And she also, the co-wife, they were able to retain the farm, were able to work. But you meet other people where they lost everything. So it then shows the reality of like a whole duality, right? Which I think is what my PhD is trying to work through. It's never about vulnerability versus resilience, or like urban versus rural. It's about the complexities, and climate change just adds another layer to it. But people still tend to survive, not in a way that I don't want to be those researchers like, Africans are just great. They just know how to survive everything. They're going to be fine. Like, you know, that narrative that has went on even across the Caribbean, across to North America, where the Black body just seems to absorb pain in such a way that it's just never ending. But in a way that shows you that the pain is there, but you still have a sense of resiliency somehow. Now, how long can this resiliency last is what's scary, right? Because you have compounding factors over companion factors. So
thank you. Any other questions for Binta? I think we are almost out of time. Are we out of time? just maybe one more. I know, Binta, if you're in Gambia, it must be very late now.
Oh, no, I mean,
Yeah.
I fully, first I told Ryan, let me go first, and I'm like, you go, I have to.
Okay.
But I want to thank you guys for the opportunity, because this was a good practice, I must say. This is the first time I'm talking about this, and Ryan must be so annoyed, because I'll be like, oh, I'm gonna die. But I think Ryan did so well, and I think it's, I hope our research, thank you for African Studies, thank you for Prof. Lo for really supporting and believing that we could be fellows. Honestly, it's really helpful, because then you feel the need to come and present and see if what just writing makes sense.
And
Maybe on that note, we could all give Binta our applause. You did a wonderful, wonderful job. And
Thank
Agri,
you.
is it okay if I thank everybody and close up our session?
Go ahead, yes.
Yes, yes. Thank you all for coming and making the first of this series of Senior Doctoral Fellows series talks so successful. Great presentations, both Ryan and Binta. We had a great conversation. We wish you all the very best as you finish up. And I know your future students are going to learn so much from both of you. Have a great day, everybody. And we're going to be back here next week, same time, with 2 more presentations. And it'll be great to see some of you there. Thanks to all the new college colleagues and our librarians who are there. I see some wonderful undergraduate students who I worked with. Thanks so much for coming. And we'll see you next time. All the best. Bye-bye.